Welcome to Viewpoints, listeners. I'm your host, Henry Grossek. It'd be a great pleasure to welcome a regular guest on Viewpoints back with us today, Dr. David Roy, who's a lecturer in the School of Education at the University of Newcastle, New South Wales. Welcome again to Viewpoints, Dr. David Roy.
Oh, thanks, Henry. And as always, it's just great to be here to talk to you.
And it's our pleasure too. As we said before, David, it's strange and peculiar times. Everybody knows that. We don't need to dwell on that. But let's have a look. Firstly, how has this pandemic impacted on yourself and your fellow academics? We've talked a lot about schools, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you're in education yourself. You have a lot of colleagues. What's been the impact on the tertiary sector?
Well, the tertiary sector has been quite badly hit. I think that the people I feel the most for are many of the kind of the casual staff that work in universities. There is a large number of lecturers and tutors. I think it's now over 60% are not on fixed contracts. And one of the major issues that universities have had is because they've gone online, we haven't needed the face-to-face tutors. So there's many people that have been quite concerned about their potential employment. And with some universities, and I've been quite fortunate that my university has not been hit by this, but because some universities have moved towards relying a lot more on international students to help fund research through their income, because there's been such, shall we say, research cut in universities, then some universities are struggling with their finances, and they keep changing the rules of the government wage support and business support to ensure that universities, which are mainly not-for-profit, are not counted in the not-for-profit supports. So there is an ironic crisis for some universities in their funding just at the time during a pandemic when we realised that perhaps higher education research can actually help ensure that we find things like vaccines and have a better understanding of health and a better understanding in education of how to actually support people online. For me personally, it's not been that bad. I've had to move some of my courses because I'm very involved in the creative arts, and they have such a practical element that needs to happen face-to-face. I've had to move them into another semester where we will hopefully be reopening up as slowly Australia opens up its businesses and borders and the lockdown. But lots to be discovered about that still.
Yes, and part of our focus today is moving beyond this pandemic to what things will look like in the future. What changes have you had to make in the way that you deliver your courses that you can see being of relevance post-COVID-19?
I think for me and for many of my colleagues, it's going to be the online Zoom discussion, having that video conferencing and actually realising you can get work done and that you can work more from home probably will mean that there will be a significant change in just the infrastructure of the solid buildings. There'll be less need for buildings and face-to-face meetings to some degree. The fact we have video allows you to still have that communication. And there'll be a lot more courses, hopefully, going online that will actually be useful online courses and have a depth to them. There have been at times some online courses have been more a tack-on at the end of a face-to-face. And so for those students who are trying to study online, it's not been as good an experience. I think it's going to be much better now, having had this experience both at universities and in schools. And that should be good, particularly for people returning back to university who maybe want to do either postgraduate study or start a degree for the first time as they retrain, that they'll be able to work and also do their learning online. And I think that can only be beneficial. We're finally embracing 20th century technology in the 21st century. So that is good. There are always benefits. There's also some downsides, and that's coming through in the teething problems that are happening just now in schools in particular with online learning. But we'll have to wait and see how that changes the system for the future.
Yeah, one last question on the tertiary sector that's certainly intrigued me is, from an economic point of view, the international students form a very important part of the tertiary delivery in our country. Post COVID-19, given, as you mentioned, there'll be a lot more online work done, will there be as great a need for as many international students to come and live in Australia? And if not, that could have an impact on our economic side of things too.
I think you're exactly right, Henry. That's going to have a massive impact if that happens. I think face-to-face will always be the best form of learning where we can offer it. But one of the benefits of having international students is that many of them actually then develop and settle down within our nation, and it allows us as a nation to grow and bring in fresh and new ideas, and also allows us to build contacts with other countries that allows us to collaborate, that allows us to also travel there and engage in a world community and share research. And that is a good thing to do, not to be isolationist and cut off from the rest of the world. So, and there's also the ancillary economics, as you say, with accommodation, with work in different sectors in the hospitality industry, with businesses actually earning a lot of money from the multitude of international travellers and people working and living in Australia from abroad. So I think that's going to make Australia have to rethink quite carefully how we actually run as a nation and how we engage internationally and look at other markets and how we grow as a nation, both physically, and also economically, and also just within concepts and ideas and knowledges, because the more you share with other viewpoints, the more you grow mentally.
It's a good point, and as much as it's been very challenging, it's a time also of great opportunity, isn't it, David?
Yeah, it's great opportunities for both. Actually, for the nation, for us to think about, how much can we actually do as a nation that can then be created and exported. So there's going to be lots of discussions in every country about how much we need to outsource to other countries, how much we need to redevelop our own resources, and maybe rethink our whole economic structure as we rebuild from the pandemic, because the pandemic has affected us economically. Is there ways that we can make a better world and as some businesses are saying, we deal with climate as we deal with economic recovery and reshape education and reshape our lives so that we use the best from this event rather than dwelling on the challenges and the hardship that's come from it.
Now, you've had a long and passionate interest in the educational well-being of children with disabilities. From your perspective, how has this pandemic impacted on their education?
I think it's been mixed. It was interesting to hear Dan Tahan, the Federal Education Minister, talk about the fact that we need to reopen schools because the most vulnerable in our communities are suffering in education, and he targeted low SES, he targeted Aboriginal children, and he mentioned children with a disability. And while I thought, wow, at last we have education ministers recognising that the most vulnerable have been let down by our system, putting them back into schools again, they will still be vulnerable and they will still not necessarily always get the best educational outcomes because they will still not necessarily be fully supported. For some kids, it's been a real struggle because they haven't had some of the supports that they do get in those schools that give excellent support. But there are other kids who've actually thrived in the online environment because they are suddenly seen as just a child online rather than the label that they've been given before, and they've been able to work at their pace within the security of their home. So it's more to do with, I guess, the cultural capital and the ability of the home to have resources. So I think that the low SES has been a much bigger impact for those who've been struggling because they have not had the digital equity. They've not had access to computers, or they've not had access to family members to give them support that other families might have had. So again, it's been a mixed bag, and I would love to see for the future that maybe we look at a variety of options available to not just children with a disability, but to all children, to those that thrive more in a home online learning environment. If that works for them, maybe we should embrace that. And I just hope the rhetoric where they say we must send kids back to schools because they're vulnerable is then matched with them changing the support structures for those kids who are vulnerable and actually having a true needs-based support packages across the country, not just in, say, schools such as your own or other schools that I know of in all the sectors, independent, Catholic or public, because they're all good and they're all bad in different ways.
Absolutely. It's a good point you make, Dave. We're going to take a short break and you hold the line.
No worries.